Well, I was desperately trying to take notes as I was listening to Jakob and your presentations and fascinating talks and works that we saw. And I tried to pick out some themes that I thought run through, in fact, all of the presentations that we saw. And to start, the question of interaction or interactivity, participation in audience keeps coming up. And not only interaction built into a particular work, but how physical movement works in installation spaces, and the gestures of audience members individually or in groups, and how you can stage that. And I was thinking of sort of socially spectator movement. If we're in a black cube installation, we often seek out the walls or somewhere to sit because we want to see, but we also don't want to disturb others' ability to view. And in a white cube, we seek spaces in the center or benches in order to engage the artwork and see the artwork around us. And I was looking at the works that you were presenting and thinking how sort of difficult both the social determination of the spaces in and of themselves and the expectations that the audience must have when they come into these spaces, and then trying to figure out how to engage and experience these works that are often thwarting or changing those experiences. And I was struck by the fact that you often mentioned that people were hesitant or shy, and that children often were the best audience, perhaps because they don't have such fixed cultural expectation, and they kind of go into the space, and unless someone tells them otherwise, this is a space to play in. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we can think about a kind of different, more complex and messier experience that takes place in these kinds of installations, and how we basically can think about staging them and helping the audience along and learning from audiences experiencing and using and misusing various kinds of works. That's where we will start and see who will want to pick this up.
I could say that I wanted to connect with Rebecca, because she said that when interaction is at stage, you are too intelligent, perhaps as a grown-up, to really believe that it's reality. And what was funny in my case, because in the virtual reality cube, the cave, whatever you call it, when you are totally immersed in a separate reality, illusion, but still, you do believe it. And the funny thing was that even if you know that you stand on the floor, you are in a cube which is just 6 projections, the brain doesn't really. You do get, what do you call it? Dizzy. And I find that very funny, because the rational part of you says, yes, of course, I'm standing here, but whoa! And people screamed at this provocative. I worked a lot with that in the beginning, to see how the visual wall could make you feel claustrophobic. Or I did corridors where people were feeling also trapped. Or I did a very big space. The cube is, depending on where you are, but in Stockholm, for instance, it's just 2 by 2 or something. But I presented a gigantic room, like a palace room, and people felt totally comfortable. So it's just to mention this illusion where you said that you are, people do believe it. I just wanted to say.
Of course, I think, yeah, of course people have physical sensations and they have moments of confusion, but they know. I mean, they don't really believe they're in a palace. You know, if you ask them, very comfortable. Right, but if you ask them, were you in a palace, they say, no, I was in a VR cave in a representation. I mean, there's not, I think that sometimes in older accounts, you can read these diary accounts of people who are at the 1900 World's Fair, and they went to a panorama, and they will write these accounts as if they really did confuse representation with reality, and I think that's a fantasy. I don't think that we honestly confuse representation with reality, although there are moments of confusion or physical sensation. We know I mean, something is a
yeah, we
representation.
know, but I mean, you know, I've been told that, whether it's true or not, my husband has to tell you, but that people who have very grave burns on their body, if you show them ice, they feel relaxed. And they feel less pain. So, I mean, even if you know that you are burned, and even if you know that what you see is an illusion, apparently the brain accepts this kind of
Suggestion.
Some
Yeah.
questions from the audience?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Unless they want to.
Do you think there are various kinds of knowledge? Because modern neurology, science of brain science, depicts at least two basic kinds of knowledge: the knowledge of your body and the knowledge of your brain. And what they basically state is that you can't think yourself out of an illusion, because once you're in it, your body has internalized that knowledge that you're in it. And that reflects a bit upon what you say about the people with burns feeling more comfortable in ice. And that's, I think, very interesting for us who are museum curators to work with the fact that you can't think yourself out of an illusion. I find that very comfortable, actually, because it means that your body sometimes knows more than your brain, and I find that kind of reassuring.
Do you want to add to that, and then we can leave the audience?
Yes, I only want to add that as it is from the brain science perspective, not the difference if you have experiences in the cave of illusion or in the reality. The brain is old-fashioned, you know, and we have no added and external computer which tells us in the moment where we have experiences, this is illusion. We don't have it in our brain. We can reflect about it with distance, and we can also reflect in situations. But with the reason that our brain is evolutionary built like an old city, and now my people who are studying with me here and project leadership knows what I'm talking about, with the thing that our reptilian brain and our old brain structures are present always, means that we have not really the ability only with a lot of distance to reflect about what we are in. So it is a real sensation in the moment where the body is acting, and the brain will mark it as a real action. Even if your second brain, the cortex, decided then it was only an illusion, you know. So this is what we have to know, and everybody who is studying movie knows that. And this is why movies are working. This is why people can be manipulated in the military by simultaneous actions. The brain realizes it as a real action. So this we have to accept, because this is not new, and this is how the brain is working.
Would you like to respond to that, or open up?
I have a little anecdote, because when I began with the confrontation with virtual reality, I was fascinated by how I thought the brain was kind of reacting, not always rational, but sometimes, as you say, with the back, the old part, the snake part. And I started studying brain technology, brain and neurology. I have friends who have written, and I've talked to many people who are into research about the brain. I also studied philosophy on my little level. And it was a very interesting, actually, I think he was Swedish. I forget the name, I have it there. But he says that it's very hard to define, and nobody has, in fact, defined what is reality. Reality for him is when you can see your hands. If you can see your hands, you think that you are in the space you are. Which is why, just as an anecdote, I was never into the goggle idea of presenting a 3D experience, because you can't see your hands. Whereas if you stand in the cave and you see your hands, you tend to believe it more. That's all. But reality, I don't know what it is, virtual, or isn't everything, is it an illusion?
Let's talk about experiences instead.
Yeah, let's do talk about experiences, and I wanted to hear from you two with these not just the inside experience that you staged the installations, but also when you were in a large public space, a city, dealing with all of those different components. And you talked a little bit about that at the end. How do you stage the experience for such an sort of unwieldy audience that are going in and out, and cars and traffic perhaps even? How do you think about that as an experience?
I mean, yeah, the city for always is a inspiring environment for us, but of course it disturbs us. The best is to switch off all the lights, to get rid of the cars and make a totally new city, like Rome. You know, it was something fine 2,000 years ago. Let's destroy it and rebuild it, even if it's digital. It's much better.
Okay. I wouldn't agree 100%. Well, with today's new technologies, you can create everything what you want. You don't have to destroy buildings or anything else. You can create whatever you want. You can make a reality you want. You can. Well, we are already living in such times that the younger generations, like maybe students, should say something about it, because they are using already different way of they are playing games, they are using internet, and the virtual reality might be not in the different meaning. I think it's different time, because virtual reality was really interesting and very deep research genre. But as we talked a bit before, this is started, or we found out that it's a bit like that end path. And now there is a different way we look for, which is also, we use the virtual reality, but not in the sense like we thought 20, 30 years ago maybe. So I think...
No, but it's an expression to virtual reality is what we used to say to enter the cave. The cave is kind of dying, but the virtual reality is still... It
exists, but in different meaning, I think. We imagined it in different way, like it is now. We are facing different, different way of treating it and using it. We are using it, in fact, I think.
So I think that Rebecca's talk really showed what comes after, as it were. If we think that virtual reality is kind of phasing out as a fad, perhaps more than anything else, then augmented reality and mixed reality is much more brought to the fore, and the idea of not distinguishing so harshly between the virtual and the physical and putting them in opposition to each other, but rather allowing all of this, as you were talking about, an experience that really has the computational, the digital representations alongside the physical, if it's our physical experience and an embodied experience, or if it's physical and material objects that we have in space or manipulate in space in various ways. And when I think about that development, I think that, again, Rebecca reminded us of the importance of the historical awareness of these different kinds of exhibition models and ideas of thinking about experience. And many of them get lost in history, and I wanted to kind of tie back into perhaps two things here. One is the question of the digital and physical, or in Jacob's presentation, the idea of non-art artifacts, which I found really fascinating, and those were perhaps apparently YouTube movies and Chris Cunningham music, and I was thinking, how are these non-art artifacts? But I was, so two parts of a discussion that we might have then is, either are the distinctions useful to sort of say virtual, real, art, non-art, or sort of should we move beyond that in some way, and how do we do that? Both in our work, and of course we have to understand the modalities in which we work, the affordances and characteristics and so on, but, and I think it was, Daniel was saying, the critical reflection about those things, is that just an academic discussion, or is that something that we can, should we keep these distinctions, or should we push at them more? I was wondering, so that's one part of what we can discuss. And the other is the more mundane about documentation and saving works and presenting works, which I also think came out of several of the presentations of how do we document or somehow represent works and keep them alive, not just through videos and images and anecdotal evidence that we saw much of today, but keeping that idea of experiencing an exhibition, and how do we bring that, or keep that memory somehow. So these are two things I would like to offer to you for discussion. You may pick which one, or who would like to go first. Perhaps.
I could like just say that in my particular case, most of the work I've done for so long are like a piece of music. Mm-hmm. It comes and it vanishes. And if I want to do it again, it's very tough to show a documentation. Yeah, I would have to redo it. Mm-hmm. Or if not, you have to consider it a piece of music that has been performed and basta. And that's quite frustrating, but that's what it is, for me at least. There's no documentation that can really justify.
No, and of course it's not the same thing. Academics have different ideas. We want to keep the work sometimes in order to study it and talk about it, of course.
It was the same concern for us as well, that we can show many of documentations, but the feeling of it will never be the same when you really enter the space, or you really touch it or hear it. As well, all our works are digital, they are just zeros and ones, so I'm not really sure if it's art, but I think it's a decision of the audience.
But that's the thing about the performance. Performance happens in a certain place, in a certain time, and you can make a documentation for a portfolio or to show it to somebody else, but the experience is there at that moment. That's it. It's very important to experience it.
Yeah,
experience it. I think that's the main thing about the performance.
I agree. It's very difficult to communicate these kind of installation experiences after they've happened. We worked on a large-scale AR version of a play once, and wanted to somehow preserve it, and so turned it into a flash game on the computer because it needed interaction, it needed spatiality, right? But it's still, I mean, that's a totally different project, really. I mean, it's only ever some kind of representation of the first thing, or it becomes something else entirely.
I mean, I guess this isn't only a problem for digital media, it's a problem for all modern art.
Absolutely. But I also...
I wouldn't call it a problem. I think it's a rather advantage of the experience. That's why we still go on and appreciate the experience of it. That's why we don't sit in front of the computer all the time. We go outside and try it out. That's a big advantage, I would say.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that since I have a camera, video, and everybody has a video camera now, even a telephone, you can of course grasp the idea of something and make it something else, which is what often happens. It's not kind of a documentation, but it could be a second work. Sure. And I document a lot by photographs, even if I was a little rushed here. I have some photographs that I consider another piece of work just as valuable as, I thought it was very interesting to see, although of course it would have been much more fun to be there because that's 3D. This was just, but it was very interesting too, because you're still, it's another kind of experience, it's another kind of work. And particularly I think that photographs can justify something, stop the animation. And take out and do another piece.
And that's something that's happened a lot in panoramic photography, where they're displayed as distorted photographs in a different setting. I think Susan wanted to say something?
Yeah, I want to pick up on the notion and the phenomenon of performance, because I think that we've used this word increasingly across disciplines. I work with a lot of designers, and it's increasingly used as a workshop modality or as a way of experiencing relations between people and objects. But I'm willing to guess that each of you has a slightly different notion of what performance is. But what often happens is that we assume that everyone understands the same thing about performance, or that it's not something that is worth exploring. So I would like to just briefly ask each of you what, if you can think of it now, what do you mean by performance, and in particular, who performs, who or what performs in your work?
Yeah, we can start it because we are as well performers. We didn't pick up any of our performances to show you today because it was another topic. But we are doing audio-visual performances as well, where we really on the stage, and of course maybe it's not as representative as a dancer on stage. We are behind our lovely computers. But at least the experience again, it's much better because the audience is much closer. You have an interaction with, you feel them. It's not like just a video, but you just push the button and the play button, and everybody can watch the movie as a cinema and they leave. Now you feel it, and of course it has a big impact on the effect at the end, that you have real audience over there, and it's not just an internet YouTube video and they can watch it maybe the same because you can record it after that.
Yeah, and during this audiovisual performances, we are cooperating with the sound artists and making the picture and the music live in a certain place, in a certain time, depending on our mood and circumstances, and this interaction between us as video makers in this moment, or video art makers, and the sound artist. So he also looks at the picture, we listen to music, we make the picture under the impression of the music, and he watches the picture we create, and he makes the music under this. So yeah, this is the most...
Something like a discussion between us. Another performance which is, I'd like to mention, it was something like an itinerary between a dancer, the musicians and the video makers, like such as we, where the dancer, the projection field was a table, a bit, of course, in an angle so people could see what is projected on the table. The dancer was behind the table, the projector was hanged up above the table, and we've been projecting herself on a plate with lovely dressings all around, some salads, some tomatoes, and she was like a worm inside the plate and dancing all around.
And in this case, she was reacting on the picture.
She was reacting on the picture, but she was watching at herself by herself, which was already recorded before. And meanwhile, we had two performative or two musicians not playing, of course, music what they already composed before, but it was everything is
it was improvisation
from their side as well. So it was a 3 times itinerary and generative performance. So even we didn't know what will be the end of the show. But it was really nice. So I think that's much more about the performance. So it's again a lovely experience on the moment where you are, and the documentation can give you just a feeling, but it's not the reality.
Well, I think that's a huge question, almost like what is art, because there's a whole field of performance studies, dedicated to looking at performance, and what comes under the purview of performance studies is like all of human behavior, and even if you look at stuff like actor network theory, non-human behavior as well. So I think it's very difficult to define performance in any definitive kind of way, but I guess there are a lot of different kinds of performances, and different things can be understood as performance in analysis.
That's really, I totally agree with you, but you completely sidestepped the question. When you're working with your particular media, is there one particular notion of performance that seems to be there? Like, do the old panoramas somehow come to life and perform through argon? I'm not asking for something that can't.
I think that's an interesting idea.
That can't be shut down, but I am actually asking for a definition. And even if it's relevant to one particular project on one particular weekend that you're doing it, I think that we're at this stage now when we're working with bodies and media and interaction, where it is important that we take a stance, really.
I'm not sure I'm prepared to take a stand. With the projects that we've worked on using the Argonne browser, I mean, we're not really coming from a performance place, to be honest. These are experiments with an emerging technology. So I think you could look at the Barker panorama as a performance, as you suggested. I think that's a very interesting idea of the panorama itself, coming back to life and performing. There's the performance of the person who holds the iPad and moves. There's the performance of somebody else who may be watching that. So in that case, I think those might be some options.
Since I've also worked with Argon panoramas, I think for me the most revealing part of working with a panorama is the user's gestures, and the fact that, and I'm struck by this over and over again, panoramas that can be sort of low resolution, partial and so on, because they require you to physically move around in space and touch your way around the space in order to see the image and in effect actualize the image part by part, in and of itself becomes a panorama, because you do not have the overview of the panorama as you perhaps do in those historical examples that Rebecca was talking about, where you do enjoy the panorama, you can look at certain aspects of it, but you also have the overview, which is lacking in an Argon panorama because you're basically looking through a window. And so for me that would be one place at least to start to ask those very particular questions about what a performance with Argon panoramas would be. That's what I would say. Would you like to also?
Well, I would just say that to me, my daughter used to be a dancer. When she performed a dance on the stage. That was a performance. I have done art performances where I have done actions, you could call it, where I've done a particular intervention in time and space. And that, for me, was a performance. But I thought you did a performance with your window. To me, that was kind of
we all did by giving a talk, and everyone did by walking in this room today as an academic or a student or a scholar. And
yeah, but
a lot of performances.